The World Series is over, and the odds for who will be in the next World Series are already out. We'll talk about those odds, plus what lessons were learned from the 2022 playoffs that the Royals can take and grow from during this offseason and next year. All of that and more coming up on today's Locked On Royals podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, your teams every day.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Let's get it going on the Locked On Royals podcast, on the Locked On Podcast Network, your teams every day. I am your host, Rylan Styles. You can follow me on Twitter at Rylan_Styles. Follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Royals. Email the show, lockedonroyals@gmail.com. On today's show, we're going to dive into the Kansas City Royals odds to win the 2023 World Series, plus talk about the lessons that you can learn from this postseason, which can help, teams build and shape their organizations for success in the coming off seasons. What is the new way to win in baseball, and how will some of these lessons change as we get more data points on the new rule changes and on kind of where this team, where this sport is going with these new rule changes from around baseball. So we'll talk about that as well. So a lot to get into today. I want to thank you so much for making Locked On Royals your first listen every single morning, every single day. We're here for you talking Royals baseball. I had to cut last week a bit short because I just had an awful cough. Still have the cough to some degree right now. So if you hear long pauses, it's because I've had to cough and hit the cough button. But other than that, we should be able to thrive through another week of talking Royals baseball here on the Locked On Royals podcast. Also, check out Locked On MLB for a great postseason recap over there as well, and offseason preview for all the impending free agents, which we're going to get to. We're going to do that later on this week, talk about the free agency pool and what are some realistic names that the Royals could target as the offseason continues. And, of course, check out Locked On Astros as they celebrate their World Series championship, and Locked On Chiefs celebrating a huge Sunday Night Football win over Tennessee. So a lot going on here on the Locked On Podcast Network, and we're happy to be a part of it. Now, let's start with the fact that the World Series has come and gone, and that means that the baseball season has come and gone, and that is also very, very sad because we all love baseball and wish that it was baseball season year-round. But I really believe that baseball feels like it has the shortest off-season. Like, there's only 140-something days until opening day, which just is incredible whenever you consider that, before opening day, you get a month of spring training, a month and a half of spring training. So really, there's 80 days until until pitchers and catchers and all the baseball things start to happen. And the Royals have a lot to be excited about because they have the brand new, manager, and I'm going to count this as a brand new ownership. As I mentioned before, I think that these moves of firing the pitching coach, firing the manager, firing the GM have all kind of put a stamp on, okay, this is when the Sherman era begins, and we see how he operates a baseball team and not how Dayton Moore operates a baseball team. So a lot to look forward to. And I got an email this morning, and it was from our friends over at BetOnline, who we're going to talk about later on. And they talked about the opening 2023 World Series chances. So the odds to win the World Series for 2023. Of course, the favorite is the LA Dodgers. The LA Dodgers are 11-2 to win the World Series. The defending winners, Houston Astros, they're 7-1 odds to win the World Series. And then you got the Braves, the Yankees, the Blue Jays, the Mets, the Phillies, the Padres, the White Sox, all filing in below that. Then the Cardinals, the Mariners, the Brewers, then the Red Sox, the Rays, the Giants. Some things that stand out to me so far. We'll get to more of them. Interesting that the Phillies are ahead of the Padres and the White Sox. Now, the White Sox hired Pedro Grifol, who, of course, is near and dear to the hearts of every Kansas City. And I think that that is a great hire. I think that that hire of Pedro Grifol will allow the White Sox to really burst onto the scene next year and kind of show how good this team is. Like this White Sox team, when they're healthy, which health has been a problem, but also when they're actually properly managed, which I think that Pedro Grifol can do more than Tony La Russa could do. They can actualize a lot of this talent. They have some of the best talent in baseball. They just got to be healthy and got to be managed properly. I think that those are two things that you can expect from them in the next season. So I find it interesting that the Phillies are ahead of both those teams. I know that the Phillies just made the World Series, and maybe that's kind of how the odds get set. But I think that the Phillies run was kind of more of a miracle run than something that's sustainable. But for the Phillies' sake of it, and for the odds makers' sake of it, you have a big market with Dave Dombrowski, who's going to push all in to win a World Series any time that he can. And now I'm sure that the ownership will now even more so dip into the pocketbook to try to get over the hump, seeing how close that they were this year. So maybe that kind of plays into it as well. But I was interested to see the Padres and them below the Phillies and the Blue Jays to some extent as well. The Red Sox being above the Rays, seems like kind of like the Lakers, how the Lakers are always heavy favorites, even though we know that they have terrible teams. Like this year's Lakers team was like, I want to say like a top 10 title odd winner whenever we knew that they weren't like a true title contender, but Vegas knows a lot of people will bet on the Lakers. A lot of people will bet on the Red Sox. So you want to juice the odds a little bit for them. So I think that's kind of what happened there. The Giants, Angels, Orioles, and Guardians all in that same tier. And then you have the Twins, Rangers, and Tigers. They are 50-1 for the Twins and Rangers, 60-1 for the Tigers. And then you have your Kansas City Royals at 7-1. Kansas City Royals being at 7-1, 75-1, I should say, is interesting because they're ahead of the Diamondbacks, the Cubs, the Reds, the Rockies, the Athletics, the Pirates, and the Nationals. So they are ahead of 7 other Major League Baseball teams to win the World Series. They're only, a little bit off of the Twins and the Rangers and the Tigers, who are at 50-1 and 60-1 respectively. I think that this Royals team, of course, is not going to be a title contender this year, but with a very young team and a new manager that can really burst onto the scene, and I think that the Royals will make some improvements, at least in the margins, through free agency and through the draft, that you begin to look at a team that will be much more competitive this year than it has been in recent years, where I can't say the same for the Diamondbacks, I can't say the same for the Cubs, can't say the same for the Reds, Rockies, Athletics, Nationals, Pirates. So I think that that's where kind of the odds get set there. It's not necessarily about who will realistically win the World Series, but kind of where they'll where they're going to kind of finish in the standings, so to say. But that's just one of many things you can bet on with our good friends over at BetOnline.net. Folks, you step in right now, BetOnline.net, and you can bet on football, NFL, college, but on basketball, NBA, or college basketball. You can even still bet on baseball. We just mentioned the World Series future odds, but you can also bet on other aspects like who will win the Cy Young Award, which will be announced pretty soon, and things of that nature. But check it out today. BetOnline is where the game starts for the best odds, lines, news, scores, info, podcasts. Check it out. BetOnline.net for all your favorite betting needs. And since baseball season is over, you can go to BetOnline.net, go to their sports book, and bet on the Chiefs. And so right now, the football weekend is over, which means another one starts right around the corner against Jacksonville. The Chiefs are 9.5-point favorites right now at home against Jacksonville. Go check that out today, betonline.net, and tell them that Locked On sent you. We are back on the Locked On Royals podcast, on the Locked On Podcast Network, your teams every day. I am your host, Rylan Stiles. You can follow me on Twitter at Rylan_Stiles. Follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Royals. Email the show, lockedonroyals@gmail.com. on today's show, brought to you by BetOnline. I want to thank you so much for making Locked On Royals your first listen every single morning, every single day. We're here for you talking Royals baseball. For your second listen, go check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast. What this is the biggest stories in sports each and every day given to you in 30 minutes or less from our host, Pete Bukowski, going beyond the box score and behind the scenes with our Locked On podcast local experts. So go check it out today, Locked On Sports Today. Go check them out today, wherever you get podcasts from, including on YouTube. They are there and available for you, just as we are. So that was the odds to win the World Series for next year. I got on that little tangent because I thought that was very interesting, kind of where the teams were placed at and everything. But overall, for baseball this season, I think that there was a lot of lessons to learn from the postseason, and from where this team is and where this team kind of wants to be, even just looking at this World Series. So in this World Series, you had that crazy game one where the Astros get up 5-0. Then the Phillies tie at 5-5 and hit the home run, and on a walk-off, but a home run at the top of the 10th to win it. And then, which was just an incredible game in game one. And then from there, it kind of wasn't very competitive, mostly because of the games, like the game that the Phillies won. After that was a 7-0 win. But I think that this season showed two different things, two different avenues. The first thing it showed was the Phillies, like the Phillies getting to the World Series, because they never gave up on themselves, and they had the ability to fire Joe Girardi, at the quarter point through the season, getting that new manager, that new voice, those new ideas. It unlocked something for the team, and it made them better. And I think that you can take that for Kansas City and look at next year. Like, yes, it'll be a lot of the same guys, it'll be a lot of the same players in this roster. But having that new manager, having a new pitching coach, having a new coaching staff, like, those things matter. And those things will have new ideas and open up new avenues and bring these players closer and get them better as players individually, just with the new coaching staffs. Like, the Phillies are proof that sometimes these same players can still work and still be good and still win games that they weren't winning before, just by getting fresh voices in the clubhouse. So that was a huge lesson that was learned for the season in terms of the Phillies individually getting to the World Series. For the Astros, drafting well. It sounds obvious, but to sustain success, you have to draft well. Look up and down that Astros lineup. How many of those guys are homegrown guys like Altuve, like Jeremy Pena, a rookie that wins, an MVP in the CS and in the World Series. Like, you have to draft well, and then you can supplement that talent with trades and with free agents. You cannot skip steps on this. You can't just draft one really good guy and then go all in on free agents and trades. You have to draft a foundation for your organization. You have to draft replacements for guys like Correa, who are inevitably going to leave. And then you can start to fill in the gaps through the trade, like getting Trey Mancini and getting other, Michael Brantley through trades and things of that nature. Like, the Astros and Phillies are give two examples of how the Royals have to win and have to compete. It'll be fresh voices for the Royals this year, like it was for the Phillies. And then the Royals are always going to have to try to find a way to draft well and sustain success through the draft. So those are just two of the teams that won the World Series that offer a ton of lessons for Kansas City. And then I think that in terms of like the game-to-game stuff and the individual games, it's tough to really gauge anything from these playoffs, because I truly believe that baseball looks so much different compared to this year as the rules change, as you can't shift anymore. I think that will be a big deal for the future of the sport and the longevity of it and the enjoyability of it, honestly. So I'm interested to see kind of how that evolves throughout time. But those are just kind of the two things that were really sticking out to me about this World Series, like the World Series odds for next year, obviously, and then kind of what lessons you can take from the World Series teams and kind of continue for Kansas City. But it's an exciting time in Kansas City. Obviously, the Chiefs are doing well, and so that's always great, across the parking lot. But also, I think that the Royals have a lot of, a lot of things to be excited about because they have made a change. And I think change is a good thing, especially when the old school way of doing things did not feature a ton of winning. Like, it sounds crazy because they did go to 2 World Series and win 1, but outside of those 2 years, and even including those 2 years, right? Like, think about how crazy this is. So since 2000, which includes the 2 World Series appearances and the championship and World Championship win. So since 2000, the Royals have the worst record in baseball. The worst record in baseball since 2000. So that kind of grouping, of Dayton Moore and everyone that he hired, it wasn't working. It just wasn't working. The way Dayton Moore views baseball does not work in Kansas City. What works in Kansas City is the way that Cleveland and Tampa Bay view baseball. It's shrewd moves. It is talent evaluation. It is finding diamonds in the rough. It is finding wins in the margin. And you have now an owner from the Cleveland organization, a manager from the Tampa Bay organization. You have now guys and people and pieces that view baseball the way that it takes for small market teams to win. You also have a very fun young nucleus. Bobby Witt Jr. is awesome. Jim Melendez is awesome. I believe that Nick Pratto and Vinny Pasquantino are going to be very good players. I still haven't given up on Kyle Isbell yet. I think that Kyle Isbell can be a nice everyday outfielder. And what's even more exciting than that is the fact that you can't give up on these young pitchers just yet. And I think that had they brought back Cal Eldridge, it'd be a lot easier to just say, okay, well, obviously Jackson Kolar's not good. Obviously, Daniel Lynch is not good. Obviously, Asa Lacy's not good, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that with the Royals making a change, you're going to get a fresh set of eyes on all of these young pitchers. None of them whom have panned out besides Brady Singer. Brady Singer did take a massive leap since June of last year and has looked the part. But on top of your solidified good young pieces, you're going to get an actual pitching coach that can actually coach pitchers and actually develop them well, which Cal Eldridge could not do. And he'll get a chance to work with Daniel Lynch, with John Hazley, with Chris Bubich, with Brad Keller. He'll get a chance to work with Asa Lacy and that 18-year-old that they drafted from Connecticut. I can't think of his name right now. They'll get a chance to work with all these kind of first-round pitchers that they've drafted over the years. And it can save their careers. Because let's face it, if they still had Cal Eldridge, their careers would be over in Kansas City. Then they'd probably catch on somewhere else with a different pitching coach that actually knew how to coach pitchers and be awesome. But I'm interested to see kind of how this all works. And I think that this team could have a turnaround like the Phillies, where it's not the World Series. Like, don't get me wrong. It's not a turnaround like the World Series, but it's a turnaround in the sense of they go from one of the worst teams in baseball this year, they just played uninspired ball, to a team that is competitive and is scrappy and finishes, 5 or less games out of the playoffs just based upon changing the coaching staff and getting new leadership in the organization. So I think that that's a turnaround you can be excited for in Kansas City. Let me know what you think about this offseason so far for the Royals and what kind of your projections are. When you head into this offseason and the winter meetings are around the corner, free agency opens up around the corner, what do you expect this Royals team to achieve in the next year? Let me know down below on YouTube, also on Twitter at LockedOnRoyals, and on email, lockedonroyals@gmail.com. So that's what we got for you today. I'm Rylan Stiles, and we'll be here again tomorrow. All throughout the week, we're going to talk about free agents. What are some actual great targets for them, some realistic targets for the Royals. We'll also talk about how the rule changes can change baseball and what this sport will look like this time next year. We're also going to talk about the top players to watch for in the system next year to get called up, and start our player review series. We'll review the season for each individual player and deem if they had a successful year or an unsuccessful year. So a lot to look forward to on Locked On Royals Network, your teams every day. Make sure now that this podcast is over, you go check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the Locked On Chiefs podcast, the Locked On MLB podcast, and any other Locked On team that you love, like the Chiefs, like the Royals, like Mizzou, like KU, and like everything else in your life that you love sports-wise. Just search up Locked On team name, and you'll find a daily podcast there for your team. Until tomorrow, be good and be good to one another.